Hello, I am Michael Collins, and this is Media Focus. Today, we are going to be looking at the music video to Riptide, and we are very specifically going to be considering the representation of women. And just before we start, it would be really great if we could just very briefly go over what representation is. Now, representation is not the same as showing something. If it was, then we would just simply use the word show. Representation is a representation. It is where something is shown again by the producer. So when we see a woman in a music video, or anybody or anything or any concept in a music video, we are not seeing that concept. So from a literal perspective, there are no women in the video to Riptide. However, there are many representations of women. They are being shown again. And there are a number of reasons why producers will represent certain groups of people. The primary way is to demonstrate an ideological perspective. This might be done very consciously in order to present a really powerful message, for example, or it might be done unconsciously. So by analysing something like a music video, we as media students can decode and break apart and can work out what the ideological perspective of a producer is. And broadly, we can work out if a representation is conventional or if it is unconventional. And in the video to Riptide, we are going to see some pretty strong representations and some pretty powerful ideological perspectives as well, which might leave you fairly on the fence about what you're going to argue in the exam. And that is completely fine. No matter what your opinion, the examiner is going to want to hear about it. I'm going to want to hear about it as well. So, just a little bit of context, because we haven't actually gone through this before. Riptide is a single by Vance Joy. It is the first single to be released in the USA. He is an Australian artist. His debut EP was called God Loves You When You're Dancing. And Riptide became a platinum-selling single. The video was directed by a guy called Dimitri Basil and a woman called Laura Gorin. And the video has, at the time of this information being produced, has had nearly 100 million views on YouTube, which is pretty significant, especially for a fairly straightforward indie pop song. So Vance Joy is Australian. He's a singer-songwriter, and he's signed to Atlantic Records, which is a subsidiary of Warner. Now, Atlantic and Warner are both major labels. This is big business here. So while we might call this indie folk pop in terms of its genre, the artist himself is anything but independent. He is part of a major conglomerate. So this is pop music. This is popular. This is big selling. This earns a lot of money. As far as I know, this was his biggest single. I'm not really 100% sure if he did anything after this, but it doesn't really matter, because all we really care about beyond this basic bit of context is the actual music video itself. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to define these following terms. And these are the kind of terms that we can use when exploring the representation of women in music videos, and also indeed in any other kind of media product as well. So first of all, objectification. Objectification is the process of turning an individual, a person, into an object. It, for example, if you present, an extreme example would be, for example, in the video to Blurred Lines, by what's his name and Pharrell, we see women who are essentially just placed there to look nice, even though they're looking fairly bored. That video is obviously pretty sexist, arguably fairly tongue-in-cheek. So when an individual, for example, a woman, is simply just put there for a single purpose, that is called objectification. We also have this idea of the male gaze. Now, this is a term used by the theorist Laura Mulvey, the film studies theorist Laura Mulvey. And the idea of the male gaze is the idea that every media product is made primarily for a male audience, which means that every time we see a woman in a media product, we must assume that she has been placed there purely as the object for a male gaze, a male look, to be looked at by men. So this concept is obviously fairly controversial, and we really do need to consider how women are represented versus how men are represented. So the theorist John Berger, for example, took this a teeny bit further when he argued that in a media product, men act, women appear. So while male characters will drive the narrative forwards and will do stuff, female characters tend to be used in media products to look nice and for an aesthetic purpose, and they rarely tend to push the narrative forward. Now, obviously, there are plenty of examples of media products which break this rule. However, in general, we can apply this concept of the male gaze to many different media products, including both of the music videos that we'll be studying for this unit. The next term is very closely related to objectification, so much so that we generally use the term sexual objectification. Now, sexualization is a process. Every word that ends with ation is a process, and sexualization is the process of making something sexual. So if we see somebody in a film or a music video or a TV show, and all we know about them is that they look attractive, that they look hot, then this process is sexualization. And this can be fairly extreme. So, for example, if you ever watch a film and we have a gratuitous shot of a woman in the shower, and it doesn't really seem to drive the plot forward, but hey, we're watching them, she's naked. This is sexualization. And certain theorists, for example, Laura Mulvey and Elizabeth Van Zunen, would argue that in general, it is women who are sexualized and not men within media products. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to this. The exception that students really like to point out is the film Magic Mike, starring Matthew McConaughey, about a bunch of male strippers. And that very, very much is the exception that proves the rule. It is very rare to see men sexualized to the same extent that women are sexualized. If we look at superheroes, for example, just compare the marketing material to something like Wonder Woman compared to the Captain America films, for example, and you'll see very clear differences in the ways that men and women are represented. The next term is voyeurism. Now, voyeurism is to take pleasure at watching someone when they don't know that they're being watched. It's very, very creepy. It's illegal in the UK. We often call people who are voyeurs peeping toms, for example. And we do it all the time when we watch a film or TV show. So just think for a second, how many films or TV shows have you watched where someone just starts taking their clothes off or starts having a shower? Now, you wouldn't actually get to see people in the shower in everyday life. That would be crazy. That would be weird. That would be creepy, especially if they couldn't see you doing it. However, in films and TV shows and music videos, we often will see people in a state of undress and vulnerability, and we completely take it as being normal. So there are many examples of voyeurism in the video to Riptide, which we're going to be looking at. And this next term, scopophilia, well, that sounds extremely creepy. The suffix philia there comes from the Greek. It means to love. For example, a bibliophile is someone who likes books. A cinephile is someone who likes films. And there's another term I'm sure you're thinking about right now. But in general, the term phile there just purely means to love. Scopophilia, however, is Also fairly creepy, scopophilia, or scopophilia perhaps, is the love of looking. It is taking pleasure at looking. So this term is very closely related to the concept of voyeurism. And, we might even combine the two terms. For example, the audience is positioned in a context as scopophilic voyeurism, or the audience is encouraged to partake in scopophilic voyeuristic pleasure in this scene by being positioned with an extreme close-up, etc. So in order to understand the video to Riptide, we are going to be using a couple of theorists, and I'm going to introduce them at different points in this presentation. So the first theorist we look at, she is key theory number 8, if you're keeping count. Her theory is simply feminist theory, and her name is Lisbeth van Zoenen. No idea if I'm pronouncing that right. She's Dutch. So Lisbeth van Zoenen wrote a textbook called Feminist Media Studies, and in this textbook she combines lots and lots of different theories by lots and lots of different people. And there's loads more stuff that she talks about in it, but we really just need to focus about what is on this slide I'm just going to go through. So Van Zoenen argues, much like Laura Mulvey and much like John Berger, that men's bodies and women's bodies are encoded in completely different ways in media products, and this is constructed through media language. So Van Zoenen here argues that men and women will be shot in completely different ways, that different cinematography and editing techniques will be used depending on whether a man or a woman is on screen. And this really reinforces the hegemonic differences between men and women in our society and within media products as well. Van Zoenen also argues that women's bodies are used as a spectacle to sell media products. So this goes back to this idea of men act, women appear. So women's bodies used as a spectacle, they are something to be looked at. So there is always this assumption that the audience is, without exception, a heterosexual man. And this also can apply to products which are aimed at teenage girls, or women in general. So yeah, this is slightly strange, and we really do need to see some examples of this in context. There are a number of reasons for this if we think this through. One of the reasons for this is that the presentation of a hegemonically sexually attractive woman acts as a meta-narrative for the female target audience and gives women something to aspire to, which in turn reinforces this notion of patriarchal hegemony, this idea that men rule society and that women occupy a very specific space in society. So we're going to be seeing lots of aspects of the sexualization of women in the video to Riptide. So let's start off with this shot, this is actually from slightly later on in the video, from the minute that we looked at in the last session. So in this shot here, we see a mid shot of a woman from behind, and she has no face. Well, she might well have a face. She's looking out to sea. All we really know is that she has blonde hair and she's looking out. And however, we can instantly see that she is stereotypically female from this. She is being constructed in a stereotypical hegemonic way. And one thing that you either have done already or one thing that you might want to do is you could go through Riptide and you can make a screenshot of every single last time a woman is represented, because there are loads and loads of examples of the representation of women in Riptide. But if you do the screenshot task and if you go through, you'll see that in general, women are represented in a fairly consistent way. Women in Riptide tend to be hegemonically, stereotypically attractive, tall, white, blonde, young. which generally tends to conform to a hegemonic patriarchal worldview of women. Yet also at the same time, we need to consider the idea that perhaps this video is doing something slightly different, that actually it might be subverting and challenging the objectification of women. And one of the cool things about Riptide is that it does both at the same time. On the one hand, it is a very conventional and even sexist representation of women, and yet on the other hand, it presents a quite subversive and challenging critique of the way in which women are objectified in our society, as we're going to look at. Now, when a media product has multiple meanings, and most media products do, this is an example of what we call polysemy. Now, polysemy, and if a media product has polysemy, it's called polysemic. Polysemy just means multiple meanings. So poly, many, semantic meanings. So we need to consider both of these meanings when we look at Riptide. So here we see a couple of shots from different points in the video. Not 100% sure if this is the same actor. However, the women in the video to Riptide do look very similar throughout, and I think this is very, very much a point that the producer is making. So women in the video are repeatedly presented as an object to be watched. And this isn't just because the women in the video are hegemonically sexually attractive. This is also reinforced through a variety of different ways. So in the shot on the left down here, we can see a young woman, her back to the camera, and she is undressing, which has symbolic connotations of sex, sexualization, and a proetic code of nudity. There are many, many times in the video where we see disembodied and isolated sections of women's bodies. So we often see bare feet, we see feminine hands, we see arms, we see other parts of women's bodies. And this presents a fetishistic and voyeuristic construction of women in this video. To be quite honest, it's very creepy. And one of the dominant readings of this video, going back to Stuart Hall here, is that we are supposed to find this video creepy. It is supposed to be upsetting and unpleasant to the audience. One thing which is also interesting and creepy about these two images is that these two images both position the audience in a voyeuristic mode of address. They are both shot using a telephoto zoom lens from a distance. In both cases, they are POV shots where we are viewing the woman and she cannot see us. So these are both examples of a voyeuristic mode of address. And depending on the audience member, this can either be pleasurable or this can be very uncomfortable. And I think the dominant reading here is that it is supposed to be uncomfortable. I don't think this video is really supposed to sexually titillate the audience to such a degree. One shot we come back to over and over again in this music video is the master shot of the woman singing the song. Now, this is interesting and subversive in a number of different ways. One, she is slightly older than might be considered to be completely hegemonically normal for an indie pop music video. However, she is blonde, she is thin, she is hegemonically attractive. She has very pronounced cheekbones and she also is wearing red lipstick as well. The shot is framed in a close-up, mid to close-up, not quite a big close-up, which would be a headshot. It's fairly conventional for a performance shot, and yet maybe it's just slightly too close, so we can't see her body. So again, the use of the close-up mid-shot here positions the audience in an uncomfortable mode of address. Her makeup is stereotypically hegemonically acceptable for a woman, and if we consider her performance as well, there's something kind of interesting and creepy here. She is not completely into this performance. She is not really going at it. In fact, she seems a little bit distracted. She's looking out just to the left of where we as the audience are looking, so she's not looking directly at us, which is very conventional for a music video. All of this constructs a highly polysemic and maybe even highly subversive representation of women, and once more positions the audience in an uncomfortable and creepy mode of address. Now, we call this shot a master shot. And a master shot is often a performance shot where we see the performer coming back throughout the video. And we might cut from the performer singing the song to some narrative footage, and then we'll cut back to the performer. Now, in this video, quite significantly, we have a woman singing a song which is sung by a man. Now, there are many possible connotations for this. Maybe one, she is singing karaoke, so she's performing, and yet we can't see the audience, which again makes it slightly creepy and desperate and weird as well. So again, it really does position the audience in an uncomfortable mode of address. And as we come back to this master shot, well, things just gradually get more and more weird and unpleasant. As the video continues, if we compare the lighting in these two shots, the performer is positioned out of the main high key light. So, and the shadows become more and more pronounced, and she kind of folds into the shadows. So this functions as a symbolic code, suggesting perhaps that she is losing her mind and perhaps that she is mentally unstable. Now, this is another stereotype about women, which is often brought up time and time again in horror films. This idea that women are mentally unstable, that women are easily scared, and that women lack a sense of self and identity. So, for example, in the horror film Suspiria, directed by Dario Argento, we see the main character gradually losing her mind as she attends a ballet academy, which actually happens to be infiltrated by witches. In the, well, it's not a horror film, but in the psychological drama Persona by the Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, we see two women who gradually turn into one woman. And this idea of a persona swap is repeated over and over again in many other films. So, for example, in the David Lynch film Mulholland Drive, where two women gradually lose their minds and end up combining into one woman. So this reinforces a stereotypical and pretty creepy notion that women are inherently insane. And this is further reinforced by the subtitles at the bottom. Now, again, this is something which is also common in karaoke. You have a song, you might have subtitles at the bottom of the screen. It's something to sing along to. And here, the subtitles are wrong. So instead of "you gone and sang the words wrong," the subtitles have been changed to "you gone and sank the world's wolf." And again, this is something which is only flashed up for a second. And the audience, again, are positioned in a very uncomfortable and creepy mode of address where they might start to question why this has happened, or even if they actually read the subtitles right themselves, or if they heard the lyrics right themselves. And of course, the mise en scène of the model's makeup is really, really important here because it presents a whole range of polysemic interpretations. Now, this shot completely lacks any anchorage. We do not know what is happening to this woman, and it is never ever explicated or explained exactly what is happening to any of the women in this video, aside from the fact that there is some kind of very real or perhaps symbolic threat. Now, there are many connotations that the mise en scène of the makeup can connote to the audience. So one symbolic code which is raised is this idea of abuse and assault. So the glistening of her tears as the high key light shines on her face is connotative of assault and depression and misery. And suddenly the video gets very, very dark indeed. It also subverts traditional hegemonic and patriarchal, hierarchical ideas of female beauty as well. Her makeup is not perfect, her makeup is smeared, and it leads to her looking very unpleasant and scary, almost like some kind of deranged clown, I suppose. So depending on the audience's interpretation of this song, she might be drunk, she might be depressed, she might be going through a bad breakup, she might have heard some very bad news. the fact we keep coming back to this master shot over and over again, and her makeup has changed so much, almost seems to suggest that she's been singing this song over and over and over again until something extreme like this has happened. But again, because there is no anchorage to this shot, and in fact to the entire video there's no anchorage, there's nothing to weigh down the audience, it is never explicated what's going on, which means that we as an audience have to make up our own mind. So one of the interesting things about this video is a lot of the horror actually goes on in our own head. And just, peeking at this, as we repeatedly turn to the camera, to the character, she becomes increasingly disheveled, her makeup smudges, and her expression becomes more and more vacant as she sings the words wrong. So another reason why this is happening as well, even just beyond the representation of women, is that this is very much breaking the rules and restrictions of music videos as well. In general, if we see lyrics at the bottom of the screen, they're supposed to match up to the lyrics of the song. So does this video challenge or reinforce representations of gender? Well, I would argue that it does both to a massive degree. So first of all, let's just consider the idea that this video presents women as vulnerable and as hegemonically less powerful than men. So along with the representations of women, the music video also presents a number of scenes which offer images of violence. So we see a female hand being stabbed by a knife. We see a gun being pointed off screen. Now both a knife and a gun are both proeretic codes. They both suggest that something awful is about to happen. And in both cases, the object of this violence is a woman, which reinforces this notion that not only are women sexually attractive things which are there to be looked at, to make reference to Lisbeth Van Zoenen, but they are also the subject of violence. And this is something which is not only acceptable in media products, but is also pleasurable to look at. In this shot here, we also see the woman clutching her own neck, and we see what looks like blood to be coming over her hand. But again, we're not sure. It might be makeup. We have absolutely no idea, and with no anchorage and no resolution to the equilibrium of the narrative, we will never ever be sure. But again, it's quite clear that one of the ideological messages about this video is in some way about the notion of women being the subject of violence. So in order to explore this idea further, we're going to look at another feminist theorist. So we have here bell hooks, and bell hooks' idea is quite similar to Van Zoenen's idea, but it's just that bit more complicated and probably also that bit more interesting as well. So bell hooks argues that feminism is a struggle to end patriarchal hegemony and the domination of women. So for bell hooks, feminism isn't just something for women to do and everybody else to ignore. So bell hooks wrote a book called Feminism Is for Everyone, which was pretty eye-opening because it suggests that if women are represented in a negative way, then by extension, then also men are represented in a negative way as well. If we suggest things, for example, that women are emotional beings who cry all the time and are completely useless in certain situations, then the inverse of that, the binary opposition, if you like, is that men should never ever cry and they must be good at certain things. So this not only creates certain expectations of what women can't do in society, it also creates unnecessary expectations of what men should do in society. So for bell hooks, feminism isn't just a lifestyle choice, it is a political commitment. It is this idea about achieving equality between the genders. And it goes beyond this as well, because for bell hooks, it isn't just about being a man or a woman, but there are also issues of race and class and gender to explore here. And this will change the way in which a group in society is exploited and or oppressed. So, for example, a black working class woman is going to be significantly more oppressed than a middle class white woman. And this is something which is fundamental to bell hooks theory. So, considering all these ideas, objectification, sexualisation, scopophilia, voyeurism, and the male gaze, we need to come up with an argument here. Because on one hand, this video seems to be extremely sexist. It seems to be extremely violent towards women, and we see loads of stereotypical and frankly almost identical women being attacked by some off-screen male force. So is it feeding in to the oppression of women in a patriarchal society? So if we consider the ideas of Stuart Hall, for example, he argues that stereotypes are always a bad thing for society because a stereotype will reflect an imbalance in power. And that if we present women as just being one thing, as being vulnerable, as there only being one way of being sexually attractive, then this denigrates or puts women down and reinforces this idea that men are more powerful. But there's also another argument as well. I did this in the wrong order, but the argument on the top here is the video objectifying women in an ironic or knowing way. So quite clearly, this music video is being deliberately over the top, violent, sexualized, sexist even. But is it doing it for a reason? Is this objectification here trying to raise a bigger point about women in society? Is it being ironic? So this concept of irony is a concept which a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand, not the least Alanis Morissette. Irony is the expression of one's meaning by using language that normally signifies the opposite, typically for humorous or emphatic effect. So basically is where you say one thing, but you mean the other. And we sometimes do this in order to emphasize a point. So yeah, is this video being so deliberately violent and sexist to raise a point about how women are represented in society? Well, to be quite frank, I really hope so, because if not, this video is just quite frankly sexist and even potentially misogynistic against women. So misogyny is literally the hatred of women. And if a media product is misogynistic, it represents women in a consistently negative way. So I'm just going to go through a whole bunch of points here about how the video to Riptide encodes feminist ideology. Let's flip things on its head and let's argue that actually Riptide is a feminist music video. So we can argue that this video is a parody of sexism in music videos. This early shot, this close-up of a book called How to Photograph Girls, seems just so over the top that it surely is being ironic. It is making a point about the way that women in music videos are always there to be looked at by a heterosexual male audience. Many of the shots of women in this video are wearing stereotypical male clothing. So we see women dressed up not just in swimsuits and things like that, but we also see women dressed up in more masculine clothing as well. We also see some shots of women holding their arms out, shot from a low angle. That shot is there fairly early on, just after the shot with the man holding the card, which may well demonstrate power, this idea that women in this video are in a position of power and authority. We have this mid shot of a blonde woman bound in the mise-en-scène of tightropes. Now, this might be something creepy. This might be something fairly bad, which has been put in there in order to entice or maybe repulse the audience. But actually, is this symbolic of something else? Is this presenting an argument about how women are represented in society? Is this an idea about Laura Mulvey's notion that women are consistently represented in a sexualized way? Is this critical of the idea that women are consistently stereotypically represented as the weaker sex? The idea that women are tied down with responsibilities, for example, the responsibilities of motherhood, of the patriarchal hegemonic notion that women should be cleaning the house. So depending on how we see that shot, it's either very creepy or it can be quite a powerful shot. The whole video also lacks anchorage. So we need to come up with our own conclusions about what this video means. So on the one hand, we need to be quite frank. The video provides sexual gratification for the male heterosexual target audience. We see lots of shots of hegemonically, stereotypically sexually attractive women, often in a state of undress. But also, if we look at how these shots are anchored, for example, the shot of the woman being undressing, it's going way too far back. If we look at this shot on the left here, well, this is shot in a voyeuristic mode of the dress. I don't think anybody's going to look at this and think, that's not creepy. So by being positioned as a voyeur, is this reinforcing this idea about the hegemonic power that men occupy in society? And is it critiquing it? Or is it just purely there for sexual gratification? A few more. So, ironic representation of patriarchal hegemony. So we see a mid-shot of a man standing in front of a woman with a torch. She has an exaggerated pose. Yeah, I mean, that's an argument that we could make. So the shot of the man and the woman together in the graveyard, potentially this is representing men as being weak. We have the sexualized images utilized as referential codes. So a significant number of film references draw attention to the negative representation of women in cinema. This is probably my favorite interpretation of this video. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the intertextual references that this video makes to other films, in particular horror films. But just to draw on this now, I like to think of this video as being a criticism of how women are represented in horror films as a consistent object for the male threat to attack and destroy. So by recontextualizing this in a video with no anchorage, it subverts the representation of women and forces the audience into a really uncomfortable mode of address. And we really do have to consider why it is that we actually watch horror films in the first place. Another idea is we have a woman singing in front of a crowd of no one. Is she being rebellious? Does she have her own agency? That's something else to consider. We also have a woman singing the song which is originally sung by a man. He's not even in the music video. It's perhaps potentially, although maybe this is a fairly weak argument, it's perhaps potentially that women have taken charge here. The music video completely lacks any anchorage, so the audience are forced to make their own responses about the representation of women. Yep. We have this is a bit creepy, we have this mid-shot of a gagged woman escaping from ropes. Now, it lacks a sexualized connotation to it. I don't want to go into this too much, as this video is aimed at teenagers, but there might be some fetishistic sexual connotations to being tied up with ropes. However, here it is purely being presented in a non-sexualized way. The woman is clearly in distress, and we are positioned as someone in the background who is not helping her, which positions us in an uncomfortable and unpleasant mode of address. So ultimately, we can argue that at the very least the video is highly polysemic, but most of all, it is subversive of the hegemonic ideological perspectives which are normally seen in music videos. Another concept I'd like to bring up now is we also have a complete lack of identity. The actor, there's many actors in this video, many female actors, all of which are tall with blonde hair. They all look very similar. I've got to admit, the first time I saw the video, I thought they were all the same person. And I think that is very much the preferred reading of this. And I think perhaps this is an argument about the way in which women are presented in music videos, that there is one stereotypical hegemonic assumption about what makes a woman attractive. So we can make this argument that this video is subversive subversive of these hegemonic ideological perspectives which are normally seen in music videos. So just to conclude, here's a question you might like to think about and you also might like to answer as well. Discuss the representation of women in the music video to Riptide by Vance Joy. Make reference to key terms in media language. Now, this is the kind of question that you might get in the exam, and you will be asked to compare the video to Riptide with something else. So another music video or advert or something else. And the question isn't going to say, talk about scopophilia, talk about voyeurism, or anything like that. That's up to you to bring this stuff out. And this is an opportunity to talk about everything that we've talked about in this video. My advice for every student who is taking the exam is don't just go off on one. Don't just talk about objectification, sexualisation, the male gaze. Don't just try and name drop Lisbeth Van Zunen for no reason, but instead pick out very specific scenes from Riptide. You are not going to be able to talk about the whole video. That is absolutely going to be impossible. So thinking about my favourite shots, they would probably be the master shot of the woman singing, her makeup getting gradually more smudged. Well, how does that represent women? And I would probably argue that it is a highly polysemic and subversive and complicated representation of women, which encourages the audience to make up their own response, but in general reinforces this notion that women are negatively represented within media products and positions the audience in a very uncomfortable mode of address, which then they have to deal with. There is also another argument as well, and that is the video is cool and weird and it doesn't really mean anything. And this is a completely acceptable argument to make. And when we look a little bit at intertextuality next time and just some of the films that this video kind of vaguely references, we're going to see many examples of that. Okay, thank you very much.